everybody. I hope you enjoyed the introduction to the video. Today is all about aquascaping the 4,200 gallon aquarium. After nearly 3 years of work on this build, aquascaping is complete. I am really excited for the way that it turned out. And in today's video, I want to talk about my aquascaping methodology, talk about the materials that I use for aquascaping this aquarium, and I want to go through the aquascape in detail, talk about the different habitats that I created and why I made them that way. Then I want to go through the products, tools, and the methods that I use for creating the aquascape on the 4,200 gallon aquarium. When it comes to aquascaping methodology, I have evolved the way that I have aquascaped aquariums from that very first 5 gallon aquarium where I bought the fluorescent yellow and green plastic plant and the treasure chest that opened and closed with the air bubbler. I've really come a long way, and I've really geared my aquascaping towards habitat. And with this aquascape, I really tried to balance out my habitat to be about 75% of the aquascape and about 25% is for aesthetics. And that isn't really anything new. This isn't groundbreaking with aquascaping by any means, but it's where I have evolved my method to go. And I really enjoyed the aquascaping in this aquarium because it was such a large environment. And it might seem like balancing so heavily towards habitat versus aesthetics might not always look the best. However, when you have beautiful aquascaping materials to work with, it makes the job to make an aesthetic aquascape very easy. And for aquascaping materials, I had a lot on hand already. When I moved from my last home, broke down my 1,600 gallon aquarium system, I had a whole bunch of stuff that I put in boxes or buckets and put away for this new build when it came out. And I had approximately 700 pounds of Reef Cleaners dry rock, 200 pounds of Tonga branch rock, 200 pounds of Tonga shelf rock, and 100 pounds of some miscellaneous old live rock that had been dried out, some Carib Sea life rock. So there was quite a bit of material there already, about 1,200 pounds. And then I had 500 pounds of sand that I kept from my old system. And I gotta say, the sand was especially fun to reuse again because when I broke down the 1,600 gallon system, most of that sand was taken directly out of the tank and put into buckets. It wasn't washed or rinsed or anything, and it sat in those buckets for 3 years approximately, through ultra cold winters where maybe it was negative 20 degrees Fahrenheit to ultra hot summers where when these buckets were in the garage they probably reached a lovely temperature of 120 to 130 degrees. So needless to say, opening up buckets of sand that had been sealed for 3 years wasn't the most fun job, but after a couple of weeks I washed all the sand, I dried it out and bleached it out in the sun, and I was able to reuse it for this aquarium here. So I had a lot of material available, but it wasn't enough. I needed a ton more material for this tank. And when I say I need a ton more material, like I really need a ton of material. This aquarium's huge. 1,200 pounds of rock and 500 pounds of sand wasn't going to cut it. So I needed more. Now when it came to adding more aquascaping material to this aquarium to fill out the rest of the aquascape, there's a bunch of choices out there. Ultimately, I decided to go with Marco rock. I've used it in the past. I really like the way that it looks, especially like this new Marco shelf rock. I think it really looks nice, and I've never used it before. So I decided I also needed a large quantity of rock, so I got an entire pallet of Marco rock delivered to my house. And an entire pallet of Marco rock getting delivered to your house, it weighs about 1,950 to 2,000 pounds shipped, and has about 1,850 to 1,900 pounds of actual rock in that pallet. And it was a lot of fun when it got delivered because when I ordered it, it was very clear that the shipper would not deliver the pallet of rock anywhere other than in the street in front of my driveway. They would not put it in the driveway. In fact, the delivery driver said sorry and apologized about it, and then he kind of looked around and said, "Do you have a forklift?" or a pallet jack of your own? And I'm like, nope, but I got 2 hands. So I unloaded that whole pallet by myself, moved it into my garage, and it was a real fun experience to pick up all the rocks, look at them. And in that pallet, I got a few different things. So I really like the Marco shelf rock. So I requested 300 pounds of large pieces of the premium shelf rock. And I really was happy with what came in. I also requested the rest of the pallet be the Reef Saver rock. However, I did request some boulders. And I got 7 Marco rock boulders that ranged in size from about 30 to 70 pounds. And I really wanted those to be some showpieces in the aquascape, just to have some big rocks. You just don't see that too often. And the rest of it was just normal size Marco rock. And obviously, being a whole pallet, you had everything from some Rebel in there all the way up to a lot of, you know, softball, cantaloupe sized rocks and everything in between. It came in, looked really nice. Now, before I go into the aquascape in detail, I do want to take a moment to just explain how the 4,200 gallon aquarium is set up. This is a divided aquarium. There is a double divider separating 1/3 of the tank, which is this 12-foot by 6-foot section here, from the 24-foot by 6-foot section over here. The divider allows water to pass through and should block all but the tiniest of fish from going through. And the reason I did that is that this third of the tank here, this 12-foot by 6-foot section, is dedicated to what I am calling non-reef safe fish. And what do I mean by that? Well, puffers, triggers, butterfly fish that aren't coral obligates, angelfish, larger species of wrasses that tend to harm a lot of ornamental invertebrates such as snails and hermit crabs. There'll also be a variety of tangs, damsels, pseudochromis. So a wide variety of fish will go into this third of the tank. It's just going to be fish that I am a little bit more cautious of being around corals, or ones that are known to be a little bit more destructive with ornamental invertebrates. And they'll have this zone of tank here. The other 2/3 of the tank over here, which is the reef section, this is a 24-foot by 6-foot section. This is going to be a full-on reef aquarium with corals and fish in it, and it is going to be a mixed reef. And I'll explain a little bit more about how it's set up when we get to that part of the aquascape. Diving into the aquascape, I want to start with the 12-foot by 6-foot section, which is the non-reef safe area of the fish tank. When I started looking at this aquarium and thinking about the puffers, triggers, angels, tangs, wrasses, and damsels, pseudochromis, and all these other fish that are going to be in here, there's a wide variety of size, there's a wide variety of aggression, and they all are going to need habitats that are suitable for them, along with a lot of swimming room. And that is the inspiration I went for on this aquascape, was to create something that is going to bring a habitat to the animals I intend to keep. Now, in the very front of the tank here, you could see I've made a really dramatic cave system out of Marco shelf rock and some other reef saver rock, and also there is mixed in there a little bit of the old reef cleaners rock that I had as well for some of the bigger, more denser pieces on the bottom. The idea of this was to make a partially collapsed section of a reef, give it a slight angle, where I've actually seen something like this when I've been out snorkeling, where you come across a part of a reef that's collapsed partially. And I thought that would just really look amazing to give it a little bit of a dramatic angle, give it some aesthetics with the nicest looking pieces of the Marco shelf rock that I have, while also building a huge habitat of interconnected caves for large, medium, and small fish. And I thought this really turned out well. I'm really happy with the way it looks, and I'm excited to see how the fish are going to start to utilize this once the aquarium gets filled. The other thing you'll notice here is the front of the tank here, all the bottom. Instead of doing a bare bottom or just doing sand, I have done a rubble bottom. And I had all kinds of rubble that came in the pallet. Also a lot of cuttings from slabbing all of my rocks on the bottom. And that is all material that I could have used some of it for things like coral frags, but I had so much of it. And I thought it would be interesting to do something different on the bottom and cover the bottom of the aquarium in rubble. And this is going to do a couple of things. One, it will allow a higher currents that I want to keep in here with flow to not have this rubble move around a lot. The other benefit that the rubble is going to also give is it's going to create a habitat for microfauna and all the wrasses, puffers, triggers, even some of the angels and stuff. This will be a great area for forage. You know, a lot of larger species of wrasses, triggers, puffers, they like to flip over little rocks, sometimes carry them around, and look underneath them for pods or some kind of snails. You know, hopefully I can get things like stomella really populating in here and give them some natural food to go after from time to time. So I think this will be a really fun thing to see with this tank as it evolves, is doing something different other than just bare bottom. And looking at the side view of the tank here on the short L side of the tank, again you could see the dramatic shelf section area here. You can also start to see the middle rock structure, a sand pit I have in the middle here as well. And you'll also start to see some vertical rocks coming up on the side, which I'll explain in a moment. Looking on to the 12-foot panel for this side of the tank, again, the back side of the front shelf system here on the left, you could see a lot of large pillars of rock and more interconnected caves. This is an enormous cave system that I built out of these rocks here, which again should make a great habitat for some of the larger fish I plan to house in this tank. In the center of the tank, I decided to do something a little different. My past 720-gallon aquarium had a bare bottom for the non-reef safe fish, and I had a big sand tray in the tank, which worked well for the wrasses that like to bury themselves at night, but I always felt it was a little small for what I had, and most of the sand ended up getting blown out of that tray over time, and it needed to be refilled periodically. In this tank, I decided to make a much larger sand area, and I've surrounded it with some smaller slabbed rocks to kind of contain the sand, and put it, 2 inches or so of sand in here, which will make a great bedding area for wrasses that want to bury themselves at night. It'll also create a great forage area for fish that like to pick through the sand and look through it for critters. In the center of this part of the aquascape, I've got a small rock structure here, medium, small, and extra small caves. And the idea here was to create a habitat for some of the smaller fish that I want to keep here that'll give them a nice territory to be able to escape to, so they don't have to worry about a big fish trying to chase them, so they have an appropriate territory. On the back side of the tank here, another large cave system. I just piled up rocks and made them a big Swiss cheese pile of every size of rock I could think of, in every size cave from extra large to extra small. It extends out a little bit on the other side here, as we'll see here. But the one thing I want to draw your attention to is the back of the tank, where you can see the egg crate divider, which has rock pillars in front of it. And these rock pillars, there's 8 in total on this side of the tank, are something that I got from Joe Waiula at the Long Island, New York Aquarium. A couple years ago at an Aquashella, I was talking to him, and he actually had mentioned this to me about rock pillars, and I kind of really didn't think much of it at the time. I was like, well, I'll keep that idea in my back pocket in case I need it. And then recently, I rewatched the Reef Beef episode with Joe Waiula, talking to Ben and Rich, and I also watched his Aquashella talk, talking about the rebuilding of the Long Island, New York Aquarium, and these rock pillars came up again. And I basically adapted the idea. These rocks are all stacked together on fiberglass rods. I also cemented them, secured them to the top of the tank. And the whole idea here is to help cover up this divider. It's not the most aesthetically pleasing looking thing in the build, and this is the worst angle to see it from, but it is something that was necessary to have my split display that I really wanted. Now, the beauty of this rock wall, though, is when you were looking at the front of the tank a little earlier, you probably just saw a rock wall. And when we look at the back of the tank, as you'll see here, when you sit back in the office area, you no longer see most of this divider, and you just see this beautiful rock wall. And the more you go over, the more of it you see in that angle, which is, I think, is a really unique thing to do with an aquascape. I've never had a vertical rock wall that's gone from the very top of the water to the bottom before. This is an enormous piece of aquascaping in here, and it has an enormous amount of room behind it for large, extra large, and small fish back there. So it should create a great habitat for fish to have territories and hides. And also, you could see I've taken this other rock structure, sloped it down a little bit, made a lot of low caves in there. Again, the rubble rock on the bottom here has been extended out. But overall, you know, I gave a ton of swimming room in this tank, and I'm really looking forward to seeing this get filled up with non-reef safe fish. I'm really happy the way this aquascape turned out. And the nice thing is too, that the way that I've built this, if I ever needed to add more aquascape rock and material in here, it could very easily be done. I could imagine maybe one day doing some arches or other large pieces coming off this rock wall and extending into this aquascape here. But I think there is so much in here, and it might look somewhat empty, but given the footprint of this tank being 12 foot by 6 feet wide, these are very, very large rock structures, and I'm really excited to see how this looks once the fish get in here and get a chance to explore it. Now, before I talk about the aquascaping and the reef tank, I do want to explain this tank a little bit more in detail and how it's going to flow. This reef tank, which is 24 feet long, 6 feet front to back, is going to be set up as a mixed reef, but it is going to have different zones of lighting and flow. And it all starts on this end of the tank here, which is going to be the highest lighting and the highest flow section of the tank. Moving on from this side down this way, the lighting intensity will start to drop a little bit, and the flow intensity will drop the further down you get. And in a simple way of looking at it, the SPS garden is going to be here, and my low flow Euphyllia corals are going to be on the far end. Now, starting in the high flow and light zone of the reef tank, again, you start with the vertical rock wall. The difference on this vertical rock wall, though, is that I have done a lot more in terms of making a lot of negative overhangs and jagged rocks that stick out way more than the other side. And the whole idea here was to create another area which is a zone for fish, but also create some shelves and pockets that will work well for coral. Some of these overhangs, I'm actually hoping at some point possibly putting maybe some non-photosynthetic corals underneath them where they're shaded a little bit more from the light. But we'll see how things go in the future. But I'm really excited to see again this rock wall that goes through this whole side of the tank. Moving back a little bit, you have a whole center section here which is comprised of Tonga branch rock and Pukani rock. I tried to make a really open and airy aquascape here, but I also wanted to keep some good cave structures in there from the start of this tank so that fish automatically have a place to have cover. I think that's really important, but I wanted to use these branch rocks as best I could to create areas where there are a lot of flow could come around the SPS corals. So this is a huge section here that I've dedicated to having SPS coral. The other thing I think is really unique in this part of the tank is the bottom. Again, I tried to do something that was different, and I have kept bare bottom tanks before, and they're always a bit ugly to me. And I decided with this reef tank, I said, what if I took rocks and slabbed them out and used that like tiles to tile the bottom? Now, in my DIYing experiments with the running system, I did use actual tile, which ended up causing a lot of metal problems in my tank. So I needed to use something that was a natural product to tile out this high flow area. So I decided to slab rocks out. And I think it looks really nice and it's very unique and different. I'll probably toss a little bit of sand in between them. It'll get blown around. But again, the idea here is to try and create a really nice aquascape that's not going to get blown around by high water flow. These rocks should all stay in position when the water flow is up and running at full speed. Something else, I really want to thank Unorthodox Reef for the inspiration. This Pucani island here, I took a piece of Pucani and slabbed the bottom and turned it into an island for an SPS garden. I think it's going to look really beautiful there, and I'm really excited to see how it's going to look once it gets grown out. Now I do have my Marco shelf area here. However, I do want to take a look at the other side of the tank because I have a viewing window for my reef on that side as well. From the side where my office is located, this reef is just a really cool slice of the tank. Again, you get this beautiful rock wall on the left side and all the branching rock here in the center. This is going to be the one area of the tank that'll have reef viewable from both sides. And then you could see I've created a nice channel that goes straight down to that Pucani island, so you'll get a nice view of it even from back here. Then you can start to see the beautiful Marco shelf rock structure I have on the other side. Again, slabs on the bottom here, and I really think this just is a unique area to see the tank. The other cool thing is not only do I have the reef tank view, I've also got the non-reef safe section of the tank too. So overall, I get this huge viewing area with both sides of the tank in my office. And this is going to be a really cool view. Now in this section of the tank, behind the Pucani Island, I have a huge Marco shelf rock section. And I gotta say, I really enjoy the way that the shelves look. These stack together so nicely and it just looks so nice and natural. There's a ton of caves in there again for fish and an enormous surface area for corals. And it's hard to tell. There's a lot of open swimming room in front of this rock structure, but those giant slabs of shelf rock are still over a foot away from the back wall of the tank. So there's an enormous amount of room here up front, and maybe at some point in the future I'll put some rock islands in here, but for right now I'm going to keep it open because I think it's going to be really unique to see this big open swimming area with a beautiful coral reef growing out behind it. Now just past that, in the next section here, I've utilized a couple of my larger Marco rock boulders. And I thought these would be really nice and unique to start the front of a canyon. And it kind of goes off to the back. And you'll notice here, I have transitioned from the rubble rock and the slabs to full-on sand here. This will be where the flow will start to slow down, at least a little bit. So hopefully the stand will stay there. If not, I'll fill it in with some rubble and slabs later. Behind those big boulders, I've got 3 more big rock structures that are chock full of caves again. This should be a great area for different varieties of coral. I'm not sure what's going to go there yet. And one thing I have thought about with these big rock boulders, though, is possibly doing something like a Magnifica anemone on one of them, where it's a fairly high point and it's isolated. So I'm hoping that might be a great place to house an anemone like that, where it would have a place that it hopefully doesn't walk around and sting all of my corals. Really interesting part of the tank aquascape though, just going back in that canyon. And this also marks the divider for the first 12 feet of the reef tank. Moving to the other side of the reef tank, I have got more sand here. Now the bottom's all sand. And I utilized my Tonga shelf rock here to make a really beautiful cave system that's perched up a little bit higher. So give a big flat area for different varieties of coral. Not sure, maybe do things something like Gonapora might look really nice up there. So maybe start to do a little bit of soft corals or maybe some lower light or lower flow SPS corals. I think it would look really nice back there. Moving into the center of this section of the tank, another large Marco rock boulder. Again, this might be a great place to house something like bubble tip anemones, where they'll be isolated on a rock. They don't like to cross the sand, so that's usually a perfect place that I like to keep those types of animals, where they'll be nice and happy, but won't be able to walk around so easily. There's a big cul-de-sac back here as well on the sand, which I'm hoping will be a great area for some of the bottom-dwelling corals to be on the sand. And again, some rock structures going along the back side of the tank here. Thinking this will be a great soft coral garden, maybe for stereonepthias, cladalias, sinularias. I really do enjoy branching soft corals, so I think this might be a great place for some of them to be. The last section of the aquascape are these two giant caves. They're put together with a couple of the large Marco rock boulders, and the rest of it is rocks I've cemented together into arches and skylights. This rock structure measures over 5 feet long and 3 feet front to back. It is enormous. I'm planning to cover the top of it up with soft corals, LPS, and having these giant caves, I'm really looking forward to seeing some behavior out of things like royal grammas or other fish that like larger caves. I've also built this part of the aquascape as a possibility of having the ability to keep a stingray or maybe an epaulette shark. I've never kept these animals before. However, I wanted to make sure that I built a habitat with them in mind if I ever do decide that it's something that I could keep in this aquarium. And nothing's for sure. It's something I've just thought of, and I figured if I'm going to build a habitat for an animal like that, now is the time. So that's why I built these larger cave structures. I put them in the lower light section of the tank. I do say it'll be lower flow, although there's still going to be a pretty good amount of flow going on here. Again, it's all sandy bottom, and the whole backside of the tank has got more than a foot of clearance for water flow as well. So I think this will be a really unique cave system. As I said, I want to put Euphyllia and soft corals on top. I think it really is going to look nice when it gets filled out. And I'm excited to see this grow out and the possibility of how fish are going to use this habitat. So when it comes to products for assembling this aquascape, I really didn't use much. A total of 3 products, and that was basically it. The primary product that I used for fastening all my rocks together was Aquaforest Stone Fix. This is a Portland cement product that's got some additives to it to make it set really fast. And I went with this product because I've used it in the past for my 720 gallon build, my old aquarium. I was really happy with how well it held the rocks together. It's real easy to use. It sets incredibly fast, so you have to make very small batches of it. The only downside to it, I would say, is it has a gray color like cement. One thing I did do to kind of make it look a little nicer is I had buckets of sand around whenever I cemented things, so I would kind of throw sand at it after I cemented it, and that would embed the sand in the front of it. So it'd give it a little bit more of a natural stone color. However, once algae and coralline start growing, it gets covered up real quick, so you're not going to notice it. Literally used about 12 kilograms of this stuff. So there's quite a bit of it that was used. Some super glue gel, which was used somewhat sparingly. I did use this for gluing some of the rocks together with some sand, and then I just didn't do anything very large. I kept to more medium and smaller rocks with this. And the last product I used was some gardening fiberglass rods. They're 1/4 inch fiberglass rods that are 24 inches long. I use these to build my vertical rock columns for the rock wall to cover the divider on both sides. These things are incredibly strong, work really well, and we'll talk a little more technique here in a second, but really that's what I went ahead and used for products to put this aquascape together. I really didn't do anything very elaborate. Of course, some tools were needed to get this job done as well. Now, the primary tool I used for aquascaping this aquarium was a 14-inch cement saw. I got it off Amazon. It is one that I hooked up to a hose, so it's got a constant water supply on it. I did make a custom mounting for it I will say, anytime you're going to operate something like a cement saw for slabbing rocks, it is an incredibly dangerous thing to do, and it is a do-at-your-own risk kind of activity. I am not telling anyone that they should do that, and if you do decide that you're going to do it, get trained and qualified to do the work properly, and understand you can lose a finger, you could lose a hand, you could lose an arm. It is a 14-inch saw, and it cuts through Marco rock like butter. Worked great, and I would not have done this aquascape without that saw. But just understand, if that's something you're going to DIY, take the time to learn how to use it and be very safe with it. Now, I used that cement saw to slab virtually every single rock in this aquarium, with a couple of exceptions. There's a couple pieces of Bucani I didn't saw the bottoms of, and they're just sitting on the bottom, which no big deal. The boulders of Marco rock, most of those I ended up cutting with some reciprocating saw carbide blades I got off of Amazon. They're very long blades, they are meant for masonry, and they do cut Marco rock, albeit it is at a much slower rate than the cement saw does. Instead of it taking less than a minute, it's going to take you 15 or 20 minutes. I used a little bit of water to get the dust down and the blades cool with the reciprocating saw, but for the boulders they worked really well. And overall, slabbing rocks for the bottom of the tank was so much nicer. It's the first time I've done that in an aquascape. Building all these different structures with slabbed rocks on the bottom makes it that much easier. So I understand why for smaller aquascapes it might be worth it to go ahead and purchase slabbed rocks, but for bigger ones like this, you might want to see if you have a friend or a buddy or someone that could work the saw with you, or learn how to use one yourself. The other main purpose of the saw for me was to slab all the rocks for the bottom of the aquarium in the aquascape. I really wanted that tiled look. You can't purchase it. You can buy the Stacks rock product that Two Little Fishes has and Marco Rock makes. You know, it's a great product for that. Instead of stacking them up into aquascapes, you tile the bottom of the tank with them. I think it looks cool. It's just, for me, slabbing the rocks was a much more cost-effective thing for me to purchase the saw and cut all the rocks myself, because it would have increased the cost of rocks. The final tool I used a lot was a hammer drill. And a couple masonry bits here. One is just like a 5-inch bit that came with it, and I went ahead and bought like a 14-inch bit here. And I used this to drill all the Marco rocks and Bucani rocks that I use for my vertical rock walls. I gotta say, many of them had natural holes that were going through them almost a 1/4 inch in diameter. So really the drill just helped kind of, you know, open it up the last bit away to allow the fiberglass rods in. And it worked out really well. And I gotta say, this, again, it's a tool that you might not use a lot. This is a Harbor Freight special that I got years ago for my very first aquarium build, and I still got the thing and it works great. Tools, other than the cement saw, most of it wasn't anything too difficult to work with. Now, the last thing I wanted to cover in today's video was aquascaping technique. Now, I gotta admit, I didn't do anything that fancy with this aquascape. I know negative space aquascapes with all these like impossible overhangs and arches are really in right now. And I gotta say, some of them look really cool. You know, the floating shelves, things like that. I thought about doing some things like that, but it would have been so much work to do and so much additional structures to make. I just didn't think it was really right for me in the way I wanted to set this tank up. I really do like having a lot of habitat for fish right away when a tank starts. And one thing that I do see as a drawback to at least some negative space aquascapes, not all, but some, is they have no cover for fish. And it's really banking on the idea that once your corals grow in, it creates that hide and habitat for fish. And for me, I gotta have that stuff up front. So I went back to more of my old school roots of aquascaping. So some of my stuff looks like rock piles, and I'm okay with that. A couple of things I did do though is I made sure I kept styrofoam and cardboard up against the glass anytime I was stacking rocks. Almost every one of my aquascaping structures that I made, outside of a couple of them I'll talk about here, I stacked them up without any cement or glue, give them a light shake test and make sure they were okay. I let them sit there for a day or two, look at them and go, is this really what I like? Am I happy with it? And I tore things down and rebuilt them a couple of times. And I constantly was thinking about the viewing angles I was going to look at and the habitat I was trying to build, and made sure I made it right for the animals I planned to keep. And I kept the aquascape roughly 50% of the height of the tank in the whole reef section. That was to make sure I allowed plenty of room for vertical growth on the corals. That way I don't have to worry about the tank getting filled up too quickly. So it might look like it's a very low aquascape now, but I'm trying to think about what will this tank look like in 3 or 4 years from now when it's got corals hopefully growing out of the water by that time. If I do things right. We'll see. We'll see how that works, since this hobby is full of ups and downs and unknowns. Now, another thing with technique I did do was for the big caves on the end of the tank there. I made several arches in there, and it took me a few days to put those together. The method I used to do it was pretty simple. I'd take a piece of cardboard and I'd simply fold it up like a triangle here, and I'd measure out to the height that I wanted, and I'd tape this to the bottom of the tank. Then I would stack my rocks in an arch and use these points of cardboard as holds and rests so that the rocks could all sit there on their own without me trying to handle them. And then once it was stable and in a good place, I was happy with it, I'd go in with the Aquaphora stone fix and cement all the seams of each rock together. And it worked out really well. And what I did is, when I was done, I just pulled the tape up and I could unfold this and pull it out. And I repeated that process over about 4 days or so to build those caves, as you don't want to do it all at once. And I always try to do a little bit of shake testing with it to make sure that if something wasn't right, I would just, I did break it a couple of times and had to re-cement it. But I'd rather have that happen while I'm aquascaping it rather than when the tank is full. So that's the one technique I used with some cardboard for those, and it worked out really well. Literally, the rest of the aquascape in here, I just stacked rocks, made sure that when I shook them it wouldn't fall down, and then I'd cement them in place with stone fix. It's a real easy technique. It doesn't require you to have to try and do all kinds of other elaborate stuff. Again, with the stone fix, anytime I applied it, I'd have a handful of sand to throw at it, and it just helped give it a little nicer texture. I did use super glue gel in a few limited areas where I just gel some rocks together, generally much smaller stuff. I tried it on a few medium rocks, but I just got a little bit concerned with it when I'm doing it with rocks that weigh 20-30 pounds or more. I went ahead and just stuck to using the stone fix since I've got some experience with that product, and I was a little bit more trustworthy of it than the super glue. Now, of course, there are those vertical rock pillars, and these are actually really simple to make. All you need is a hammer drill and rocks, and the very first rock on the bottom, you don't have to, but for all of mine, I slabbed the bottom of those rocks so they were nice and flat. The first rock, I would just drill into it a few inches so that the fiberglass rod would stick out of it and be nice and straight moving up. It doesn't have to be perfect. And then what I did is I would simply just pick up different pieces of Marco rock, and in a couple cases some Bucani, and look for natural holes going through it. I actually really like the way the rock structures in the reef look a little better. They're more visible, so I wanted to see them a little more. In the non-reef safe section of the tank, they do look nice, and I spaced them in and out to give them some different texture. But if you really want them to stick out, don't be afraid to have rocks hanging off in certain directions, and find those natural holes and stack them up. Now, these rock pillars are between 33 and 36 inches tall. However, I've got 24-inch fiberglass rods. So it's real simple. what I did is I take 1 to 2 rocks in each stack and I double drill it so that you'd have 2 fiberglass rods next to each other. And that would allow them to lock in a little bit and give you an extended fiberglass rod that went out of the water. And I'd use these extended ends to attach it to the top of the tank. I didn't let any of them touch the divider, and I actually used some pieces of PVC to space them out and just hold them secure so they can't really wobble or move. Once I had these assembled outside the tank, I actually pushed a few of them over, and I would highly recommend you do this. Try pushing 1 or 2 of them over. Make sure you understand what it's going to do when it hits. These rods will not break. That was what I was afraid of. And the nice thing is, with them secured and all the way through, it is really difficult for it to fall or have any risk of hitting the glass. And I will say this, I attempted a different technique of building these rock columns with fiberglass pins and slabbed rocks top and bottom. Don't do that. They break easily if they fall over. I got really scared when I built my second one and it fell apart as I was trying to move it. It's like, not going to do this. So don't do that technique. Stick to all the way through fiberglass rods. The nice thing about this is, when I assembled them outside the tank and I was happy with them, I could break them down and I just take the rocks and put them into a couple 5-gallon buckets, more or less in the order that I assembled them. And then I'd pick them up, put them in the tank, reassemble them, position them where I wanted, and it worked out really well. Some of them would stand up even at 33 to 36 inches tall on their own. Some of them would need some stability. But what I did with them in this tank is, once they were installed, I had zip tied them in, put the PVC spacers the way that I wanted them to be sticking out on the one side. I went through with Aquaforest Stone Fix and I cemented them all together vertically once they were in place, just to give them more stability. And for the most part, I got pretty much every rock seam. Now, this was a place I also used some super glue gel, and there were a few instances you could see the fiberglass rod and I wanted to cover it. So what I went ahead and did is just take little pieces of rubble rock and super glue them on to those rock columns to cover it up. And you can even cement or glue rocks between columns to fill them in. I did that a little bit as well on the reef tank to fill it in more. Overall, I really like the aquascaping technique, though. I think it looks really cool. I'm sure you could do it on the back side of a tank as well to make a vertical wall, but for me, the divider, that was the main thing I had to use technique on for the aquascape. The rest of it was pretty simple. Just stacking rocks, making sure I like the way they look, and then cementing them together with some Stone Fix on the joints of the rocks. That was overall the aquascape of the 4,200 gallon aquarium. I hope you enjoyed it. Tried to go through it in some detail. Building a habitat for all the different fish and corals in here. I really am looking forward to seeing this tank get filled up, which is not far away at all. Soon this tank will be at least getting filled up with RODI water and getting ready to be brought online fully. So it's going to be a lot of excitement here in the next few months with this build, and I hope you stick around. If you liked the video, go ahead, give it a thumbs up. Let me know that you liked it. If you got comments or questions, go ahead, leave them down below. And if you want to see more, go ahead, hit that subscribe button. And if you're also really interested in reef keeping, I'd also consider checking out the Reef Beef podcast or their Discord channel. So there's some really fun discussions that happen in there about reef keeping today. Thanks again for watching, everybody, and I'll see you on the next video.